Hi, everybody. Welcome to In-House, Outsource, Automate, Getting the Right Balance. I'm Brooke Horn. I'm the Operations and Membership Manager with the Book Industry Study Group, and we're joined today by Bill Kasdorf, a longtime BISG volunteer and a wonderful workflow and accessibility expert who's offered to give our time and talk a little bit about how you get that right balance between outsourcing, automating, and doing things in-house. A little bit of background, BISG operates our five standing committees, workflow being one of them, and we also operate an accessibility working group. So Bill is here as a representative of those spaces today to talk about these things. Bill is one of publishing's most trusted experts in workflow design, modeling, and technology integration. He's a principal of Kasdorf and Associates, specializing in publishing workflows, technologies, and accessibility, including EAA and ADA compliance, something that we've been talking a lot about in our BISG Workflow Committee and our Accessibility Working Group, which is wrapping up this year. Bill, you've got a fantastic presentation for us today. We're thrilled to see it. So without any further ado, please feel free to take it away.
All right. Thanks, Brooke, and welcome, everybody. Thanks a lot for attending this. I hope you can get a lot out of it. I'm going to start a way I don't usually start a presentation with some disclaimers. So the first disclaimer is it's a BSG webinar, so this is going to be about book workflows. There's a lot of other kinds of publishing, but I'm going to focus on books. I'm going to be providing a lot of examples, which means I'm going to be naming parties, publishers, technologies, tools, software, etc. Please don't confuse an example with a recommendation. It's true that I'm mentioning things that I probably think well of, or I wouldn't be mentioning them. But if there's one overriding thing I want you to get out of this webinar is that there is no one right solution of putting those three pieces of in-house outsourcing and automating together. In fact, there probably are as many right solutions as there are people attending this webinar. But I'm going to try to help you navigate the options and at least see how perhaps other publishers like you are making those kinds of decisions and why they're doing what they're doing. And I'm also going to be making a lot of generalizations, and yep, there are always exceptions to every generalization. So those are my three disclaimers. So first of all, I'm just going to do a quick overview of the various factors that you kind of need to think about when you're working on trying to develop a combination of solutions for you. First of all, what kind of publisher are you? I'll be going into that in some depth, but the answers are very different if you're a scholarly publisher or a kids book publisher or a cookbook publisher or an encyclopedia publisher. You're not going to answer the questions the same way. How big is your organization? It's interesting that one pattern I've seen over the years is that oftentimes the smaller the publisher, the more likely they are to do things in-house. The bigger publisher, the more likely they're going to be outsourcing. And that's partly because the big publishers just have, there's a big difference if you publish 20 books a year or 200 books a year or 2,000 books a year. The answers are going to be very different. Also, how diverse is your list? There's some publishers that just publish a particular kind of book, and they're all pretty much the same. But then one of my clients is Bloomsbury. I love Bloomsbury. I've worked with the UK side, not the US side. Unbelievably diverse publisher. They've got a whole division that's academic and scholarly. They've got legal. They've got medical. They've got engineering. And yet on the what I think of as the trade side, they've got kids books, they've got travel books, they've got cookbooks, they've got everything. They're an amazing publisher. Anyway, so good shout out to my friends at Bloomsbury. What kind of expertise have you already got? That's a huge factor. And make sure that you have a real honest sense of the expertise that you have, because it's like, oh yeah, Joe's been doing this for years. He knows what he's doing. Well, maybe he knows how it was done 10 years ago, and he's not really very up to date on current. On the other hand, so for example, a lot of people publishers are looking at AI and using AI these days. Well, oftentimes they're having to use an outside service provider to do that. But some are doing it in-house. Again, it just depends on who you've got and what their uh, appetite for experimentation is. And existing relationships are important. They count for something. I'll give you an example. One of my clients right now has been with T&Q as a prepress service provider for many, many years. T&Q just got bought by Lumina. So it's like, well, what's going to happen? Well, in that case, it's really kind of interesting because they're still T&Q. They didn't just get blended into Lumina and now they work in a different way and they seem like a whole different kind of partner to my client. Um, that in that case, T&Q didn't change, the ownership changed, but there are also so they would not be looking around at a new supplier because they like the one they've got and they know each other really well. That's worth something. And then finally, what kinds of technologies are available? And boy, it changes. Seems like daily. I just got my uh, consulting colleague Thad McElroy sent me a link the other day to an indexing software. I almost don't want to say that because I have so many friends that are indexers and I have such respect for what they do, but it was inevitable that somebody's got to be using AI to do indexing. And so I'm getting a demo on that tomorrow, right? It's brand new. I think it has been released. I'm also going to be mentioning something that isn't released late in this presentation. So of all these factors, I'm going to focus on these two because I think those are the most will give you the most insight and sense of direction. The various types of publishers and various kinds of technologies that they use. So I'll go into some detail on those. And in every case, I'm considering basically these 6 separate workflow stages: the design, the editorial work, the graphics, which is not the same as the design necessarily, composition, typesetting, indexing, and EPUB creation. So who does those things in a given type of publisher, and what kind of tools and software do they use typically? And do they outsource? If they outsource, is it to freelancers or to a pre-press service, or do they do it in-house? And anybody that knows me will say, why didn't you mention accessibility? Well, it's because accessibility is part of every one of those workflow stages. That's the main message on accessibility: is it's everybody's job in a publishing house. So I'm not going to actually stress accessibility, although I'll be mentioning it as part of the workflow issues. And what about AI? Kind of a similar answer on that one. It can be applied to any of these stages. And also, it is just too new right now. It's a very fluid situation. So I'm actually not going to mention any particular AI tools. There are plenty of webinars on AI these days, including from BISG. So let's start looking at types of publishers because their workflows differ so significantly between different types of publishers. How are the books authored and edited? If they're illustrated, how are those illustrations created, or figures and diagrams and things? Who does the composition? How are the pages proofread and refined, etc.? That's actually a big issue in a lot of publishing houses. There are a lot of different ways that gets done. And who creates the EPUBs? So let's just start with the most obvious: trade publishers and just standard fiction, nonfiction, right? So almost always the authoring is done in Word, and so is the editing. Oftentimes the editing is done in-house, but the developmental editing, certainly, copy editing is often outsourced, often to freelancers. Some publishers that are using one of the main prepress houses, sometimes they include editing in that. Sometimes it's just production that they're outsourcing. For those kinds of books, the designs are very straightforward, so it's really easy to outsource both the comp and the proofreading. Not very complicated. The publishers that really have a high volume of fiction and nonfiction almost always use external prepress services. And those services typically have highly automated composition and production workflows that are oftentimes specific to them, developed in-house. Sometimes they use existing tools like InDesign, et cetera. Smaller presses, as I mentioned earlier, are more likely to do the composition in-house or to use freelancers. And in those cases, almost always, they're going to be using Adobe InDesign for the composition. And for these kinds of books, accessible EPUBs are just a given these days, and they're just becoming routine. Most of them are outsourced. Usually, whoever is doing the typesetting does the EPUBs, but that's for front list. Obviously, backlist is another animal altogether for accessibility. That's almost always outsourced to one of the big prepress houses. If any publisher with a substantial backlist, it's a huge issue for them these days, even if they've got relatively simple books. But here's some more trade books, children's books, cookbooks, coffee table books, travel guides, etc. Those are a whole different kind of animal from the standard fiction and nonfiction, which is why I'm treating them separately. These books are very design intensive, very often color intensive, and they're often fixed layout, which is a big challenge for accessibility. So in many cases, these kinds of books don't have just one author and one manuscript coming in. The authoring is something that's happening kind of iteratively and oftentimes somewhat team-based. And the content continues to get refined throughout production in many of these kinds of books. Sometimes it's just because of layout issues, but also because, there's just tons of detail going on in these books. And so they don't sit still very, very well in the production workflow, like the standard fiction and nonfiction. They don't change much through the production process after editing, obviously. But these kinds of books can get changed up to the very last minute. They're highly designed. Most publishers of these kinds of books have an in-house design department, or they freelance the designers. And in many cases, but not all cases, of course, but in many cases, and again, depending on the volume that you're dealing with, the designer might be the one that actually typesets the book, that does the composition, and the design and the comp in that case almost always is in InDesign. Most of these kinds of books are done in InDesign. And the illustrations are typically commissioned, whereas in the next category we're going to look at, which is scholarly books, usually the authors provide the figures and the illustrations. In these cases, they're outsourced, but they're designed to spec. And this is one category that's more likely than most others to use stock photos in their workflows. And as I already said, accessibility is a really big challenge for these kinds of books, especially for fixed layout. And I will have an interesting thing to mention on that when we get to the technologies part of the presentation, because there's some recent developments that are pretty interesting. So let's look at scholarly publishers. So first of all, humanities and social sciences. Not exclusively, but a lot of this kind of content is published by university presses. And most of the university presses, there are some big ones, but most of them are much smaller than most trade publishers. And again, manuscripts are almost exclusively Word in these disciplines. The editing is almost always in-house or freelanced, not very likely, but occasionally at those big prepress houses, the editing. And an interesting thing, even though these books often appear to be very straightforward, single column, footnotes and some figures and things, chapter openers, etc., you'd think, well, there's not much design. I tell you, the university presses are the most fussy about their typographic design of any kind of publisher I know. They've got, for decades and decades, at their annual meeting, they have a design competition for interior design and for cover design. They're very, very design focused. Um, and as I mentioned earlier, in these kinds of books, the figures are almost always provided by the authors because they're the scholars that are doing the scholarship, and they or uh, uh, they're often at a university, and those universities often have graphics departments that will provide that kind of work for their faculty for their publishing books. So the publisher often just receives the figures. They don't have to do much with them other than put them in the book, except for now we've got the image description issue, which I'll get to later. In this case, the composition and the proofing and all of that can either be in-house or outsourced, but again, mostly to freelancers. Indexing is often done by freelancers. That's one of the tasks that many publishers don't do their indexing. Some require the authors to provide the indexes in these kinds of scholarly books. And then the EPUBs, again, mostly done by the compositor. Some are done in-house or outsourced to a prepress service that just does the EPUBs for them. But STM publishers are also scholarly publishers, and this is another whole different thing. Very different from the HSS publishers. This is really dominated by large publishers. The manuscripts are typically Word or LaTeX, which is a math-oriented software. It's been around forever. And in these cases, as I mentioned, the authors typically provide the graphics. The composition is highly automated, but often it's not InDesign. It's almost always outsourced. Unlike the humanities and social science publishers, STM publishers are more likely to have standardized designs rather than designing each book. So that means that they really can automate the composition process because the content is highly structured and pretty consistent. On the other hand, it's also complicated because these kinds of books have math, which is a big challenge, have tables, have diagrams and figures, and citations that have to be actual links to the cited resources, etc. So a lot more complicated content to deal with in STM. And for that reason, there are lots of hands involved and lots of different technologies get used in creating STM books. And the EPUBs and accessibility are really challenging. I work a lot in this area, and the big issue these days is image descriptions because to get image descriptions right is a big challenge. And then one more main category, let's look at educational publishers, also book publishers. So I'll start with K-12, primary and secondary school publishers. In primary schools, the textbooks are very graphics intensive, and also trade books get used a lot in primary schools. For really primary or secondary, like the highly illustrated books I mentioned in the trade category, the authoring is done by teams and the content evolves, gets revised frequently throughout production, sometimes because it's layout driven, especially when it's a fixed layout book, which many of these are. And again, the illustrations in these books are typically commissioned to professional illustrators. The publisher provides briefs. The illustrator provides some sketches, gets feedback. So there's lots of back and forth on how the illustrations get created for these kinds of books. The composition, because of the nature of the books, is mostly InDesign, but the proofreading is pretty complicated, even though the content is relatively simple, certainly in in primary grades. Accessibility is a real mixed bag in this category. Oftentimes they're relying on PDF, which is not as accessible as an EPUB, but little kids don't typically use EPUBs as much. High school, yes, but most of K through 12 focuses on at least getting the PDF accessible, which is a standard called PDF UA. High school is a mixture of PDF and EPUB, and this educational primary and secondary school education is where you most often encounter Braille these days. People who aren't real familiar with accessibility think accessibility is all about Braille. Well, I can tell you hardly any of my clients think much about Braille, except if they're in educational publishing, they do. There are Braille-based standards for those for that kind of content. But higher ed, again, a whole different ballgame here. Yes, the textbooks are often team developed, like the earlier grade textbooks. The most scholarly books are single author books, sometimes multiple author, but most of the scholarly books that are used in college and university work are the scholarly books published in our earlier category. The textbooks themselves are really dominated by very large publishers, whereas the scholarly books, a variety of publishers can do those, but more often than not, they're university presses that are doing those scholarly books that are used in college curricula. The comp is almost always outsourced, whether it's InDesign or highly automated systems, which I'll be talking about in the next portion of this presentation. And again, the EPUBs and accessibility are very challenging in this category. And one thing that is really interesting, particularly about higher ed publishing, is that there is an increasing emphasis on platforms, and we're actually starting to see books not being part of the picture. There are books in this category that are in their 10th edition or 15th edition or 20th edition, et cetera. I can't remember which publisher it was, but they basically just said, well, the 16th edition isn't going to exist because it's only going to be the platform. We're not going to make a book for the next edition of this book. It's all got to be online. So that's pretty interesting, and you're going to see more and more of that. So let's now turn and take a look at available technologies. New tools and technologies are developed all the time, obviously. This is an area that has never stood still. I've been in this business for 50 years, actually, believe it or not. And I started out with a word processor that was bigger than a washing machine, that it could do a tiny fraction of what I can do on my phone right now. So anyway, the technology just constantly marches on. So you have to keep paying attention. You can never just say, oh, we always do it this way. Don't bother me with this stuff. It's like, pay attention, people. And even the existing technologies that you use get better and better. Now, this is a point where I maybe can interject a little personal note in creating this presentation, because sometimes they get better and better, but sometimes they get different because they change all the time and they're not always better. So I've always used, since it existed, I've always used InDesign because I like the typographic control that I get from InDesign. So I do all my presentations in InDesign. This presentation just drove me crazy because, I have the Adobe Creative Suite. I've got all the Adobe programs, and that automatically keeps them all up to date. And InDesign started to just behave in its bizarre way when anytime I would just make an edit to maybe I had an ampersand and I wanted to use the word and instead in that first line. When I made that change, the screen would go blank. And I would have to back up, go to the previous page, which was intact, come back to this page, and the change I just made wasn't there. It took me at least 3 times as long to do this presentation than it usually would. So anyway, when I'm in the middle of this, suffering through this, I decided to check in with Laura Brady, who I consider just an InDesign guru. And she said, well, that's weird. Send me your file and I'll take a look at it. So I sent her the InDesign file. She replied in about 10 minutes and saying, Bill, I can't duplicate the problem. It's working fine. I don't know what's going on with this. So I just plugged away. I basically figured out how to work around the problem so I could get my presentation done. Got an email from her yesterday. She said, Bill, are you on a PC? I said, yeah. She said, "Well, take a look at this." And somebody had posted to social media that a change to Windows that 'cause I also subscribe to Office 365. So all the Microsoft tools constantly get updated as well. And it turns out the most recent update to Windows is messing up InDesign. So it wasn't an InDesign problem. It's a Microsoft Word problem. So anyway, these technologies just interact. So beware of that. Uh, so I'm just going to give a few examples because there's just a million of them. Uh, but I hope this will kind of give you a sense of where to look and how to make these kinds of decisions that fit what you need to do, what you need to have done. Uh, as I mentioned, Microsoft Word is pretty much ubiquitous. It's almost always somewhere in the workflow, except for the math-heavy stuff that can come in LaTeX. But it can be tempting to want to get them into PDFs as soon as possible. But I would hold off on that because you can't work with PDFs. You can't edit them and redesign them, etc. Ideally, stay in Word until the content is really final before you go making your pages. But in that process, I cannot emphasize enough how important using a consistent set of styles in your Word files as early as possible. This is not new news. I've been creating styles libraries, Word styles libraries for publishers well, personally for 20 years. And when I had my publishing services business back in the day, Impressions, we created, I'll give you an example. We created the Word styles library for the University of California Press over 30 years ago. They came back to me last year asking me to update that styles library. They've been using the same damn styles library for 30 years. And yeah, they've been tweaking it along the way, but it's that same old one that we created 30 years ago. So I revamped the styles library for them, and it works much better now. So even though they were very happy with it, don't just sit on this technology. Make sure that you're keeping things up to date. But getting that consistent set of styles is really fundamental. I'll get into that a little more in a minute or two. But what that does is it puts a structure into your content, and that streamlines both your editorial process and the composition process to have good structure in your content. And of course, making manuscripts consistent across the list is really important, even if the books all look different. People have a tendency to make the manuscript want to look like the book. Almost always that's a bad idea. It's better to have a really consistent Word styles library and all your manuscripts look alike, because then all your people know what's what, all your freelancers know what's what, etc. And the process is just much more streamlined if you don't jump the gun and try to emulate the book too early in the editorial process. But here's another technology that's basically Microsoft Word based, but it's really interesting. This is Typify. It's been around a long time, 100% Word based, but it's basically editorial software. It's mostly used in Scholarly and STM, but it's used for all kinds of books. I've had a lot of clients that use Typify over the years, and current clients just have finished up with the big one that's moving to Typify. Basically, it uses Word as an input and as a master file, and then it automates the production. If you use it in its full capability, it uses InDesign to actually do the typesetting. But what's interesting is that you use InDesign to generate the page proofs, and then you proofread them. You don't make the corrections in the InDesign. you make the corrections upstream in the Word file because the Word is the master file, and the InDesign is just 100% automatic from that styled Word file. Unlike some of these systems, Typify uses a proprietary XML model under the hood, but then they generate the InDesign styles from that XML, and they can also generate HTML from that for the EPUBs and online version. So, and it's particularly useful in a scholarly world because it automates reference processing, including checking things like I just did a big engagement with AMA, JAMA journals, and it's really useful in that it enables you to automatically check what in that world is PubMed to make sure that the references in a given article are correct and get the DOI, which is the identifier for that article, et cetera. All that gets automated. They have just released, by just I mean in December, they promised this program called Orion that it would be delivered by the end of the year. And isn't it amazing that they actually delivered it when they said they were going to deliver it? There's a story behind this. There's a software in the scholarly world called Xstyles. It's considered the gold standard for scholarly editing software. It's a word-based system by a company called Inera. Inera was sold a few years ago to Adapon, which is one of the big hosting platforms in the scholarly world. Adapon was acquired by Wiley, which is a giant publisher. And Wiley last year made the announcement that they were discontinuing support of Xstyles as of this coming August. That was a bombshell in scholarly publishing world because so many people depend on Xstyles. And what happened is a whole bunch of vendors out there scrambled to create a replacement for Xstyles. So I mentioned that I'm going to give examples, but not necessarily recommendations. Orion is one of at least, well, with JAMA, we started with 11 different alternatives to look at. They were one of the original users of Xstyles 20-some years ago. And their content is very critical, I should say, because it's medical and they're one of the top medical journals. So, or their journals, plural, are top medical journals. So anyway, the Orion is one of many software packages that provides some or all of what Xstyles used to do. And in this case, it benefits from consistent book designs, but it in no way requires consistent book designs. I recommended them to Norton Higher Ed when I was working with Norton, and they are very design oriented. Every book is textbook. Every textbook is uniquely designed in Norton Higher Ed. But Typify, I'm not. They're just starting with it, so remains to be seen how extensively they're going to use it. But the point is, it's not just for scholarly books, but that's their main market. On the production side, what we've seen for the past few years is the development of modular, what are called end-to-end systems. These are systems that oftentimes focus on part of the workflow, like editing and production, which is what Typify does. But there are others that go way upstream to project management and asset management, in scholarly work, peer review, editing, composition, online hosting, EPUB creation, and even downstream to marketing end to end. So there are, I'll just name DigiEdit, Digicomp from Highwire is one of the leading ones. Page Magic is another one that's one of the leading ones. Dainta from Ireland is a good one too. There's a for that AMA project we looked at I think I said 11 or 12 systems like that. Um, Typically, they enable the editor or the author to work on the content online or in Word. Um, some of them are only online. In other words, if the internet goes out, you're out of business until it comes back on. Uh, Others have the ability to provide offline work as well, but most of them are based on online. But they're very streamlined. They're based on consistent structuring. So you start out with word styles. Oftentimes, I mentioned with Typify that it's a proprietary XML, but in most of these, it's XHTML, which is HTML in the XML uh, coding, you know, and that's what EPUB requires. Um, and so oftentimes, because it's HTML, it naturally works online because it's HTML. So and then that's how you get this online uh, system where it actually does look like the final page right from the get-go. And then as an end product, it'll deliver PDF and oftentimes a particular flavor of XML if it's required by the publishing. In the scholarly world, it's JATS for journals and BITS for books. And so these actually will enable 100% in-house production. Uh, this is not really outsourcing the production, it's doing the production using a licensed tool set. Some of these uh, also offer services. In fact, many of them were created by prepress service providers in the first place because they've developed systems like this for automating their own work, and they now license them out to their clients. But don't want to neglect InDesign because it's very dominant in book publishing in general. One thing that's really interesting is that for years and years, it's been used to create the ultimate PDF as the ultimate product. But its ability to generate an accessible EPUB conforming to standards is coming along really, really well. I want to call out two friends of mine, Gregorio Pellegrino from LIA in Italy, and Laura Brady, whom I mentioned earlier. Um, the two of them, I don't think they're the only two working on this, but they were key people working with Adobe engineers to get InDesign to do really proper accessible EPUBs, including all the metadata. So that's a really cool development. And I already mentioned Typify. Yes, it uses InDesign, but the publisher doesn't really touch InDesign very much, except if they redesign each book, because all the work gets done in Word, and it's incredibly fast. I mean, I remember having Caleb from Typify, he's the kind of the technical head, do a presentation at a session I did for a few years ago for, I think it was SSP or University Presses. And during his talk, he actually paginated a 300-page book in about 2 minutes from the Word files. That's how fast it can be done. And I want to mention this one that you may not have heard of. A guy named Ken, blanking on it, Ken Jones from Circular Software. I think of it as Ken's company. I don't even know if he's got employees, frankly. It might just be Ken. But his company name is Circular Software, and it is just amazingly good at fixed layout rendering in InDesign. So very sophisticated solution for creating fixed layout books. If that's what you publish, it's well worth a look. And they are developing what I think is really amazing accessibility technology. That those kinds of books are notoriously virtually impossible to make fully accessible, but they're getting really close to making fixed layout books properly accessible. So just Google Circular Software and you'll find that. So that's the end. We've got a little over almost 20 minutes left for Q&A. Uh, I bet you have some questions, so fire away.
Hey, Bill. Thank you so much for that. So, our first question is from Edson. And I know we talked quite at length about different editorial software, but Edson asks, there are portals for submitting and creating and editing text, such as Grammarly, Editorial Manager, etc., but editors still seem to like MS Word. Do you have any ideas about using Word versus a more professional platform?
Well, usually those professional platforms incorporate Word for that very reason. So they're built on Word. Word is so ubiquitous, it's kind of taken for granted, uh, and pretty much everybody has it and everybody uses it. So those kinds of software typically process Word files to do whatever they're doing, and that's including AI-based tools like Grammarly and those kinds of tools.
Right.
So it's not as much. They're not Word. They're completely separate software, but Word's still in the picture typically.
That makes sense. Let's talk a little bit more about AI. We've heard a lot of discussion recently around how AI could or could not be helpful in making backlist accessible. We know that backlist, as you've mentioned, is a huge challenge depending on publisher size and staff size. We really want to make those books available for folks. What are your thoughts on kind of that intersection between AI and accessibility?
Well, first of all, there are two issues for accessibility, both of which are best addressed in frontlist, but the trouble is backlist already exists, right? One is how are the books structured? Are they EPUBs? And if they're EPUBs, are they EPUB 3.3? And if they're EPUB 3.3, do they conform to EPUB accessibility 1.1? That's my standard hat being on. That's what you're supposed to have for uh, EPUB accessibility. PDF accessibility, PDF cannot be as accessible as a fully accessible EPUB, but if it is PDF that you have, then it's PDF UA is the standard for that. Um, Interesting, the PDF standard managed by the PDF Association, a guy named Duff Johnson is the head of that and a terrific guy. Um, they're actually in PDF 2.0, and it actually is potentially fully WCAG accessible. WCAG is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines that all these specs are based on WCAG conformance. WCAG 2.1 AA currently for both the European Accessibility Act and the update to Title II of the ADA.
Mm.
Um, the problem is all the software out there is based on PDF 1.2, which Duff calls Adobe PDF. It's not the current version, but nobody uses the current version yet, right? So stay tuned. There will be a fully accessible PDF available not too far down the line, but right now uh, it can't be fully accessible. But since you asked about AI, one of there are basically two PDF accessibility testing tools that I use in my work. One of them is the accessibility testing that's in Acrobat Pro, and that's very useful, and anybody can use it. If you've got Acrobat Pro, don't ignore the fact that you've got an accessibility tester built into that. But it can only get you so far. So, for the image descriptions, which are a big issue, and I'll get to that in a
That
second.
was going to be my next question, is directly tying into image
Exactly.
description, alt text.
Yeah.
Language tagging has also come up quite
Yeah.
a bit.
And so for the testing, the problem is that automated testing can only get you so far. The best, the the tool of choice is Ace by Daisy from the Daisy Consortium, um, and that is automated testing. So I can't tell you how many times when I'm doing testing a client's books or journals for accessibility, they will proudly give me the ACE report from the compositor that created the EPUBs for them, and it says there are no violations. First of all, they're only sending me the first page of the ACE report, which is the summary, and it's got 0 violations. Well, if you look at the page that's about the images, it's shocking how often, yes, there's alt text for every image, but the alt text is the word image. All the images just have the same alt text that's the word image, which is totally cheating. That's not alt text, right? But they're 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 representing themselves as being fully accessible because they've got alt text in there. Daisy also has a product that is kind of guides the human review. It's called Smart, and it basically builds on ACE and then guides the human review of ACE. But on the PDF side, there's a product called PAC, and the current version is PAC 2026. You notice the date just became 2026. This is a big advance over PAC 2024, which was the previous version, because 2024 was entirely automated and you still had to do your human review. But 2026 actually uses AI to do the kinds of things that you otherwise need a human to review. So, for example, you can tell that there are headings because there are H tags in the file for the automated testing, but you can't tell if they're being used properly, if they're nested properly. PAC 2026 actually can do that. It actually sees the context and can determine whether the headings are in fact properly nested. Normally that takes a human being to figure that out. So that's pretty cool. But the thing that's cool, well, let me just say one of the things that it's worrisome about AI is it going to hallucinate? Is it going to make things up? Is it going to use my content to train on, et cetera, et cetera? Well, it depends on how the AI is implemented. So PAC 2026, for example, it works entirely offline. It is not using the internet for anything. There's no internet access. So it's only looking at your book. And that's really important. Lots of the vendors are using AI, the big prepress vendors, to create image descriptions. And you may notice that I use the term image descriptions instead of alt text. It's because there's 2 kinds of image descriptions. What is technically alt text is the alt attribute to the image tag, and it's very short, has no markup. It's a sentence or 2 typically. But an image that it's complex, charts, graphs, workflow diagrams, whatever, maps, require what are called extended descriptions. And in an EPUB, those are increasingly, they're just a separate HTML file in the package, in the EPUB, that are linked to from the image, and then they provide a backlink back to the image.
Bill, I know that you could do an entire webinar on this topic specifically, but we do have a few more questions from the
Okay.
audience. If I could divert your attention for just a minute.
Yeah, thanks for the interruption. Let me just
Yeah.
say that the point is that the AI should be confined to the context of the content that you're working with, not anything external to it. And you should always have a human in the loop. But
That's the
yes,
key. Human in the loop.
you can. I have seen good image descriptions being created with AI. I mentioned Bloomsbury. They've got tens of thousands of backlist books that they have to deal with. It's like they have to use AI to get
Yeah.
that done. Okay, next question.
Well, let's shift gears a little bit and let's look forward at identifying workflows and kind of that original question that frames the webinar of when do you go in-house for a workflow? When do you outsource a workflow? And when do you automate a workflow? So we have an anonymous question that notes we're a small to mid-sized press and we already outsource everything to freelancers. Can you talk a little bit about the differences, the benefits, and challenges of outsourcing to freelancers versus outsourcing to a vendor, such as Westchester as an example that does it all, but with a project management fee? How might you approach and evaluate this decision? And bonus, how do you think about this when you have a very diverse set of books that might not all look the same?
Yes, and that question is phrased in an interesting way because it talked about the potential diversity of the list, but it didn't talk about the size of the list. And that's why I made those as two different issues. Because if you're dealing with what I would call a manageable number of books, uh, in in the double digits maybe per year, uh, it's pretty easy to keep those in-house. And there are tools that'll help you do that. Um, so you've got a bigger list than that, those end-to-end systems. And one thing I think I forgot to mention when I was talking about those is you don't have to license the whole end-to-end systems because they're almost all modular. So you can license the modules you need, or you can string them all together and have the whole thing end-to-end automated for you. Um, in effect, that's bringing things back in-house because yes, you're licensing the access to that system, but you're not actually having a freelancer or a pre-press service do the work. You're actually doing the work on that system. So uh, if if you're a reasonably big publisher with reasonably consistent books, that would be an obvious solution of bringing something in-house and using that kind of automation. But if you're smaller and have a very diverse list, um, using an outsource it to, like a Westchester is almost always the best solution because they're very professional. They're very efficient at what they do. They use sophisticated technology to do what they do. Um, and but yes, you pay them for the service, but you know, I think one other thing I mentioned is existing relationships with vendors. Well, you've got existing relationships with employees too, right? So, you know, I would guess there are many publishers that would say, I don't want to lay off half of my staff just because I can automate this. Other publishers are saying, oh boy, I can lay off half of my staff and make a lot more money. It's like, I guess I better be agnostic on that. But that's why the decision is very individualized by the publisher. So the person
Yeah.
asking that question, um, I would definitely encourage them to look at some of these end-to-end systems that are out there,
Yeah.
um, and but also kind of look upstream and say, are there any technologies and tools that uh, make it easier to do this work in-house? For example, uh, if you're doing the books with InDesign, which is what you probably are if you're using in-house or freelancers, you're probably using InDesign. Well, you're just about to be able to create a darn good EPUB out of that InDesign file if you've styled the InDesign file right. So
Yeah.
there's something that you probably are outsourcing right now that you might be able to do in-house.
Kind of along the same vein, Bill, thinking a little bit more generally, how do you go about thinking through which roles and tasks to keep in-house versus outsourcing? Like, what are kind of those broad questions that publishers should be asking themselves when they have that question in front of them? Do I keep this in-house or do I outsource? What questions do I need to ask my team?
Where's the pain? That's the main question. In other words, where are there workflow blockages, hangups, what's not working well, etc. That's the first place to look, right? Uh, the other thing is just, you know, join BISG, join the workflow committee, pay attention to this stuff because you'll find both service providers and technologies that you might not otherwise know about. Uh, and that's, I've been a joiner my whole life. People are always surprised. How do you know all this, Bill? It's because I join all these organizations and I pay attention. It's simple.
If you could forgive the brief plug, we do include a section on every agenda for every committee and every working group that is open discussion, which means that anyone that is attending that committee meeting or that working group meeting can bring up a question that's not on the agenda and just ask that room full of their peers, which usually spans all of the segments that BISG represents. And we have some really fabulous conversations that come up around that. And a lot of times, if it's not a question that we can answer within the group based on someone's expertise, it means that it's probably a broader issue for the industry that then BISG can start devoting resources to trying to find a solution for. So definitely, as Bill has said, come to committee meetings, come to working group meetings, and get involved in that way.
And I'll
But we do
also
have a few more
mention,
questions.
but just mention quickly that, yeah, there's people like me on those committees, but Westchester's on those committees too, but also OCLC and librarians, they may be your biggest customers. They're on those committees too.
Mhm. We have an attendee who's asked, what minimal technical skills would you recommend editorial and production teams possess as AI comes into play, and also for production automation troubleshooting? So what skills should staff in-house have in order to better evaluate tools and again, how to approach that question of in-house versus outsourcing?
Well, I'm a big standards advocate, so I would have to say the more you're aware of what the standards are, the better. So you need you need to know. It used to be that when people created EPUBs, the goal was to make them look like the book. That's almost always a mistake. Uh, I see why that's important, but you really need to make an accessible EPUB. Uh, it, make the EPUB work best as an EPUB rather than making it look just like the book does. It is possible to do both. So I don't mean that they have to all be standardized. If you have branding and your books need to look the way they look, then that's an important value to you as a publisher. Go for it, but know what the standards are and keep up to date because the technologies change all the time. I've mentioned Word and InDesign as being fundamental tools, but they don't stay still. They're changing all the time. Uh, for the AI tools, many of the AI technologies are being offered by vendors that you're otherwise using. Uh, Prepress House, host, web host, etc. So oftentimes you can rely on them to guide you in terms of how to use the tools responsibly. But you'll also need to ask the right questions. Is this system uh, using my data for training data? The answer should be no. Is there a human in the loop other than me? The answer should be yes, etc.
We have just a couple questions left. Bill, if you would, could you comment on the differences between outsourcing work versus outsourcing knowledge and skills? In particular, thinking about EPUB accessibility as an example, where we see a lot of publishers outsourcing work and keeping no knowledge or skills in-house, with the outcome being that they are unable to assess the quality of the work that they have been outsourced. But keeping up knowledge can be difficult without doing practical work. Is there a case for a blended approach, doing a certain percentage in-house versus a certain percentage outsourced? How do you approach that struggle?
That's a fabulous question. And I would say that you don't necessarily need to know how to create the EPUB in-house, but what you shouldn't have the knowledge to do is to use Ace by Daisy in-house. Yes, your vendor may be using it. In fact, I've seen vendors that say, we've got this fabulous testing thing and they've branded it. It's actually Ace under the hood. It's just and Ace is free. They're charging people for using a tool that they could just be using for free from Daisy, and it's easy to use. So, and it will tell you, like I said, even though it is automated testing, it actually gives you a page in the report that just shows you all the images in the book, and it shows you the image descriptions in the book. And then, yes, you need to get educated on how to make proper image descriptions. And a couple of uh, important issues that I really do want to stress before we go away is that they should be context sensitive. In other words, you're not supposed to repeat in the image description something that is already in the surrounding text or in the caption, but also so that it's aware of what's this book about. I did an engagement with Getty Publications, very art intensive stuff, and they got image descriptions that for this book where the descriptions identified this particular person by name in the picture, but that person was not identified by name anywhere in the book. So that was actually an incorrect image description, but that's a very fine point. But the other thing is that uh, it should be audience aware. So, I do a
Mm.
lot of work with scientific and medical publishers. The T&Q fan that I mentioned is a medical publisher. Um, their audience is physicians. So, and those medical images are incredibly detailed, but they have to be uh, explained the way a doctor needs them to be explained, not the way you and I need them to be explained. So they don't say there's brown dots and yellow dots and these green lines. That's not what it's about.
Thank you. That's very helpful. All right, two questions left. We are already a little bit over time, so we'll just go through these last two rapid fire, Bill, if you have a couple extra moments.
I have all the time you got.
Thank you, Bill. So, what is your advice when choosing vendors and tools? Kind of broadly, there's so many tools out there. How do you keep up with emerging tools without going crazy? How do you go about assessing whether something is just sparkly versus a real value add?
I would say be a joiner. That's my solution because it's really uh, having the ability to interact with your peers. Uh, you know, a general organization like BISG, at least for book publishers, but I belong to BISG, but I also belong to SSP, which is scholarly publishers. I've belonged to SSP for over 40 years. Um, and uh, that's really how you can stay in touch with who's doing what, what's working, what's not working, et cetera. But, pay attention to attend all the webinars like this that you can. Uh, read all the white papers that are coming out. Um, you're right to take marketing copy with a grain of salt, but typically any vendor that you're considering should be able to provide you with references, ideally references of publishers like you that use them, so that you can talk to them. And people are helpful. You might think that they don't want to give away their secrets, but at that level, people are very helpful to share their knowledge.
And last question, Bill. This is a bit more of a technical one. So, attendee has asked XML, XHTML, and EPUB support separate fields for alt text and long description. PDF supports only one image description field. If PDF is a product of an XSL-FO process, how would you recommend consolidating the alt text and the long description into a single field for PDF?
Uh, it cannot currently be done with the sophistication that you can with HTML and EPUB, which is this extended description, which can be markup. In fact, I often say that people often use images for tables. Well, you probably created that image in a way that you could generate HTML of that image, and there's your alt text or your image description, I should say, because screen reader software will read a table. Particularly, it needs to have uh, row headers and column headers tagged as such, tagged properly. But for PDF, we're waiting for the technology to advance so that the current version of PDF gets used in the tools that we're using. Currently, that's not the case, but that will be able to be the case at some point. But sometimes you just end up with pretty wordy image description. By the way, Word is the same thing. You can put your image descriptions in Word. There's a thing on the ribbon that says test for accessibility, and it'll go through your images and give you the opportunity to put in an image description, but it's just plain text like it is in PDF right now.
That was our last question, Bill. Thank you so much for your time. This has been really helpful. We, of course, have always enjoyed your participation in our committees and our working groups. Thank you for taking your time today. Just a little bit of housekeeping notes. This session was recorded and will be posted to BISG's Knowledge Center. Usually takes us a few days to get that recording cleaned up, processed, and transcribed. So that link there is where you'll be able to find it, and everyone that registered will get that link directly. Bill has also very kindly offered to share his slides, so we'll have that available when that email goes out for you as well. And as Bill said, be a joiner. It's very, very helpful to have broad perspectives and diversity within our volunteers. So I highly encourage you to just reach out to BISG, info@bisg.org, and we're more than happy to give you a guest seat on a committee or working group so that you can just see what those meetings are like and the value there. So thank you
And it
everyone
doesn't
for
take that much
attending
time.
today.
They're typically monthly meetings, an hour long for a month, an
Exactly,
hour per
exactly.
month. You can spare an hour a month.
And you learn so much and
You
would
do.
love to have the extra faces there. So
Yeah,
thank you,
well, you
Bill.
learn a lot, and you learn who to ask for things. Like, there are other people on that committee who say, "Oh, I need to talk to that person offline about that." Right?
Yes, yes, they're great spaces for that. I come from a background where I've done marketing, I've done acquisitions, I've done project management before joining BISG, and I was just floored when I came to BISG. It's the breaking down of silos and the collaborative lift all boats nature and the amount of information sharing. So it's been just personally really, really rewarding and something that I want to support and share with as many people as possible. So thank you, Bill. Thank you, everyone who chimed
My
in
pleasure.
today, and we'll
Thanks
see
for
you
having
next
me.
time.
Yep. Bye bye.